When Ronnie James Dio died on May 16, 2010, at the age of 67, the world lost one of the most instantly recognizable voices in heavy metal history. But the story of his legacy didn't end at his funeral. In the years since, his widow Wendy Dio has had to make one difficult decision after another about what to do with everything he left behind. A storage locker full of unfinished songs, decades of unreleased concert footage, a controversial hologram that toured the world, and even 666 of his personal belongings sold at auction. Some of those choices thrilled longtime fans. Others sparked outrage from critics who accused the estate of going too far. This is the real story of what happened to Ronnie James Dio's legacy after he was gone. A vault that sat untouched. After Ronnie passed, Wendy closed the door to his home studio and, by her own account, didn't go back inside for years. "When Ronnie passed away, I closed his studio up and haven't been in there since," she told Billboard in 2015, marking the 5th anniversary of his death. "But I will." Inside were roughly 6 songs Ronnie had been working on before he got sick, written alongside longtime collaborators like guitarist Doug Aldrich and bassist Jimmy Bain. Wendy made clear from the start that she wasn't going to rush any of it to market just because there was demand. "If it's up to Ronnie's standards, it will come out. If not, it won't," she said. That approach has held up over the following decade. In interviews with outlets like Heavy Mag and the Talking Metal podcast, Wendy has repeatedly described finding songs, tapes, and odds and ends in a climate-controlled storage facility that she genuinely didn't remember existed. "I find stuff all the time," she said in one interview. "Oh, look at this. This is really good. And there's a lot of unfinished songs that in the future we can figure out how we can put them out." But she's also been blunt about her standards. "I don't want to just flood the market with any old crap. Before anything gets released," she has said, "it goes through a trusted engineer, Ronnie's longtime collaborator Win Davis, who checks whether it actually sounds like something Ronnie himself would have approved." That kind of restraint isn't the industry norm. Plenty of artists' estates rush out posthumous albums stitched together from scraps within a year or two of their death. Dio's camp has instead let some of that material trickle out slowly. A previously unheard Magica 2 track called Electra turned up on a 2012 compilation, and Doug Aldrich has said more session material may still surface. As of the most recent interviews, though, whole finished songs from that vault have still not been formally released, which tells you something about how seriously Wendy has taken Ronnie's own perfectionism, even after he was no longer around to enforce it himself. From a mobster's name to a metal icon. To understand why any of this mattered so much to fans, it helps to go back to where Ronnie came from, because almost none of it points toward heavy metal stardom. He was born Ronald James Padavona on July 10, 1942 in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, though he was raised in Cortland in upstate New York. His father was a strict presence musically, putting him through 2 hours of trumpet lessons a day as a kid. By his teens, Ronnie was already playing trumpet on stage with singer Gene Pitney. Though, as he told it later, he eventually decided the trumpet wasn't going to help him meet girls, so he taught himself bass instead. For a while, music looked like a side interest rather than a career. He enrolled at the University at Buffalo, and by his own account studied history with a minor in English, a path that had nothing to do with the stage. Music won out anyway. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, he was fronting rockabilly and doo-wop groups like Ronnie and the Rumblers and Ronnie and the Red Caps, working the small club circuit for years before anyone outside a few bars in upstate New York had any idea who he was. Somewhere in that stretch he also picked a new name. Dio is Italian for God. But Ronnie was upfront that the inspiration wasn't some grand spiritual statement. He borrowed it from Johnny Dio, a real Genovese crime family associate active in New York in the mid-20th century, simply because the name stuck with him. It's one of the stranger footnotes in metal history. One of the genre's most mystical, sword and sorcery-coded frontmen took his stage name from a mobster, not a myth. His band Elf, formed in the late 1960s, was the project that finally pushed his sound toward the heavier, more theatrical style that would define the rest of his career, and it was Elf that caught the attention of the guitarist who'd change his life. Rainbow and a slow-motion split. In 1975, former Deep Purple guitarist Ritchie Blackmore recruited Ronnie to front a new band called Rainbow. The pairing shouldn't have worked as well as it did. Blackmore's playing leaned classical and precise, while Ronnie's lyrics were pulling from fantasy and myth, wizards, rainbows, distant kingdoms. Together they produced some of the most distinctive early heavy metal records of the era, including Rising and Long Live Rock and Roll, with Ronnie's operatic range carrying songs that sounded like they'd wandered out of a fantasy novel. It didn't last. There wasn't one dramatic blow-up. Instead, Blackmore started steering the band toward a more commercial, radio-friendly sound heading into what became the 1979 album, Down to Earth. Ronnie's entire appeal was built on the mythic and the theatrical, and that didn't fit where Blackmore wanted to take Rainbow. By the time Down to Earth came out, Ronnie had already left the band, replaced by a different singer entirely. For most musicians, getting quietly pushed out of a band would be a career setback. For Ronnie, it turned out to be the opening act for the biggest opportunity of his life, replacing the irreplaceable. Later in 1979, Ronnie joined Black Sabbath, stepping in for founding vocalist Ozzy Osbourne. On paper, it looked like a no-win situation. Ozzy wasn't just Sabbath's singer, he was arguably its identity in the eyes of most fans, and replacing him looked like a job designed to fail. Instead, Ronnie helped give the band a genuine second act. Heaven and Hell, 1980, and Mob Rules, 1981, are still regularly ranked among Sabbath's strongest work, Ozzy-era records included, and both proved the band's sound could survive a total change at the microphone. It was during this stretch that Ronnie also popularized the devil horns hand gesture that's now instantly recognizable at metal shows worldwide. According to Ronnie himself, he picked it up from his Italian grandmother, who used it as an old-world superstition to ward off the evil eye. Not exactly the diabolical origin story most fans assume. The lineup that produced two of Sabbath's most acclaimed albums didn't last, though. Ronnie's exit in 1982 came down to a dispute over how a live album was going to be mixed. He and drummer Vinny Appice felt their contributions weren't being represented fairly, and rather than compromise, both of them walked. Ronnie formed his own band, simply named Dio, and released Holy Diver in 1983 to major solo success. He circled back to Sabbath twice more. A 1992 reunion produced one album, Dehumanizer, before old tensions resurfaced and the lineup split again. Though the sessions left behind an odd bit of trivia, with the outtake Time Machine landing on the soundtrack to the comedy Wayne's World. A third reunion in 2006 was more durable. Ronnie, Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Vinny Appice toured and recorded together under the name Heaven and Hell, specifically to avoid confusion with the Ozzy-fronted version of Sabbath. That lineup released The Devil You Know in 2009, their first full studio album together in decades, and it was met with strong reviews. The diagnosis no one saw coming. By the tour supporting The Devil You Know, something was clearly wrong, even if no one around Ronnie understood how serious it was yet. He was in real pain some nights before going on stage. He and Wendy had already consulted a specialist about ongoing digestive issues before the tour, and the tests at the time came back clear. The tour continued through what turned out to be his final performance, on August 29, 2009 in Atlantic City. Just months later, in November 2009, Ronnie was diagnosed with stomach cancer. The first public statement described it as early stage, and treatment began at the Mayo Clinic. According to Black Sabbath bandmate Geezer Butler, the reality was harsher. By the time doctors identified the cancer, it had already reached stage 4 and was inoperable. Ronnie moved to MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston for aggressive treatment, and stayed publicly optimistic throughout, at one point vowing he would beat it. In April 2010, he made his final public appearance at the Revolver Golden Gods Awards to accept the award for Best Metal Vocalist. He died the following month on May 16, 2010. What came after? Fundraising, a hologram, and a fight over his legacy. After Ronnie's death, Wendy took over full control of his legacy through Niji Entertainment, the company they'd built together. She launched the Ronnie James Dio Stand Up and Shout Cancer Fund, which has since raised well over $2 million for cancer research through annual events like Ride for Ronnie and Bowl for Ronnie. A tribute album followed years later, featuring artists including Metallica and Rob Halford covering his songs, with proceeds going back to the same cause. In 2018, the estate also auctioned off 666 items from Ronnie's personal collection through Julian's Auctions in New York, a number Wendy noted was intentional given the significance of that figure in Ronnie's own iconography. Then came the decision that actually split fans. In 2016, a company called iLusion built a hologram of Ronnie and debuted it at the Wacken Open Air Festival in Germany. It went on tour starting in 2017, backed by a live band made up of former Dio and Sabbath collaborators, using Ronnie's real archival vocal recordings rather than any synthesized voice. The reaction was harsh in a lot of corners of the metal press. Karen ran a piece calling the project awful, describing it as creepy, freakish, and totally unnecessary, and saying flatly that it needed to stop. Even Doug Aldrich, Ronnie's former guitarist, said publicly that he suspected Ronnie himself would have hated the whole idea. Wendy defended it at the time, telling the BBC that it was meant as a tribute and that everybody's entitled to their own opinion. But she's also been candid that the numbers never worked out. The hologram reportedly cost around $2.6 million to build, and by her own admission, that money was never fully recovered. Eventually, the hologram tours stopped, and Wendy shifted toward a different kind of tribute show, pairing restored multi-camera concert footage of Ronnie with a live backing band instead. The archive has kept surfacing in smaller ways too. A 1986 live recording from Philadelphia was released for the first time in 2020. In 2021, a posthumous autobiography, co-written with journalist Mick Wall from Ronnie's own notes, gave fans his side of the story in his own words. A documentary, Dreamers Never Die, followed a year later, built from unseen archival footage and interviews, which Wendy has said was designed to show fans the man behind the stage persona. Nearly 15 years after his death, the picture that emerges is of an estate trying to walk a careful line, protective of Ronnie's standards, occasionally willing to experiment, and sometimes getting it wrong in full public view. The vault in that old home studio still isn't empty, and Wendy has said more than once that there's material in there worth hearing eventually. Whether any of it ever meets the bar Ronnie set for himself while he was alive is still an open question, and for now one only his widow gets to answer.